He got on the phone with me. He's like, I'm going to tell you, this is going to be a very aggressive call. I've had so many people blowing smoke up my ass over the last years about this ML stuff, solving it, and none of it works. And I'm like, oh, yeah, you're right. It doesn't. So, here's where we're different. And, number one, we take boatloads of data. No one else is taking that kind of data. And honestly, garbage in equals garbage out. That's a fundamental tenet of science, right? So you have to take great data. And so we entered this as a data science program, right? Like to me, I'm a data scientist. The first thing was, how do I get great data? And since we couldn't find anybody who had a piece of hardware that would give us great data, it's like, we're making that piece of hardware now.
The startup investment landscape is changing, and world-class companies are being built outside of Silicon Valley. We find them, talk with them, and discuss the upside of investing in them. Welcome to Upside. Woo!
Hello, and welcome to the Upside Podcast, the first podcast finding upside outside of Silicon Valley. I'm Eric Hornung, and I'm accompanied by my co-host, Mr. Internal Monologue himself, Jay Klaus. Jay, how's it going, man? You remind me of Austin Powers sometimes.
I was gonna say, what do you know about my internal monologue?
I know that you don't have one. I don't think you have one.
Oh, I have one. You don't think I have an internal monologue?
I don't know, man. We were walking around CES, and you said some things out loud that I would have said in my head.
Oh, you're saying that I should use more of an internal monologue as opposed to speaking my thoughts out loud?
Not all the time, but sometimes, yeah.
That does happen by accident sometimes. Sometimes I think I'm thinking and I'm actually speaking, and I definitely speak out loud in public places, just something that I'm thinking. And sometimes it's real weird.
What's the weirdest thing you've ever said out loud that you thought you were thinking?
I don't know. This would be hard for me to tell. But sometimes I rehearse conversations before they happen. So people will just randomly hear me speaking to somebody and there's nobody there.
Do you do that like when you're walking to a coffee shop? When do you do that?
When I'm walking to a coffee shop, when I'm having conflict with somebody that I haven't resolved. It could be anywhere, really.
Interesting. See, that seems more productive to me than my initial jab. I think that rehearsing your conversations actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. No, it's good sometimes. It's useful sometimes, and then a lot of times just really weird and off-putting. So, yeah, thanks for calling me out. It is definitely not appropriate at CES when people are showcasing their life's work, and I accidentally say out loud, don't like that.
Yeah, these people are like, they have their whole family there. They're building this company from scratch. You're like, nah.
You've probably been working on this technology for years and submitted thousands of dollars worth of patents, and it's just not at all interesting to me.
Well, at least you're honest. That's big. So let's transition into our guest today.
Right into it. I like it. Let's keep this one tight. Today we're talking to Ken Sills, the CEO of Preteckt. Preteckt uses machine learning to predict vehicle service needs before they get serious. Trucks on their network learn from each other so that their customers can predict breakdowns weeks or months before they cause downtime. Their connected hardware gives real-time, unparalleled insight into vehicle maintenance needs. It's like driving with a master mechanic in your engine compartment. Preteckt is based in Memphis, Tennessee, founded in 2015, and referred to us by our friend Katie Milligan at StartCo. Ken's got an interesting background that I'm excited to talk about because he was formerly the CTO of Preteckt, is now the CEO. He was the one that developed the initial prototype of the hardware and software solution in 2015 and has built out their team of engineers, scientists, business developers, and sales professionals. So I'm interested to hear that transition for Ken from CTO to CEO, both why it happened and the practical side of how it works. Did you get some reminiscence of Super Dispatch as you were researching here, Eric?
I did. I felt that it's an industry that we've already kind of learned a little bit about, which is nice because a lot of times on Upside, we'll be coming into an industry fresh, and that comes with a huge learning curve. But now we kind of have a little bit of a background, so I think that our questions may have a little bit more depth to them than usual.
Yeah, I like learning about some of these hard technology companies that have both hardware and software because in some ways that's building two products almost, right? So I'd like to hear more about that. They've raised, from what I can tell, about $4 million in funding. They're part of 500 Startups Batch 20, and now they serve trucking fleets as well as OEMs. I'm not sure how they serve both of those groups, but I'm excited to find out.
Likewise, I think that we have some really cool themes that are going to thread through Upside and specifically through this interview. One we already touched on, which is the industry. The other one, which you touched on as well, is this idea of transitioning from technical co-founder to CEO, which we've now had a couple of conversations about.
If you guys have any thoughts on this interview as we go through, please tweet at us at UpsideFM or email us hello@upside.fm.
And now for some validation.
You know, Eric, when I was growing up, I did not have cable.
You didn't have cable? Why not?
Literally had only your basic channels, the Fox, the CBS, the NBC. My parents just didn't believe in giving that to me. And so one of the biggest changes in my life was getting cable and then Netflix. Netflix really changed the game.
Are we supposed to have a pity party for younger Jay here, or is this, where are we going?
Most of this podcast is built to give Jay a pity party, but not right now. What I'm talking about is the idea of being able to binge television and the fact that Netflix brought that to the surface, and now podcasts are doing the same. And that's what Nick Oberhaus said on his iTunes review, Binge-worthy. I listened to a handful of entrepreneurial-focused podcasts, and up until this point, I've been consistently jumping around from podcast to podcast in search of good content. In comparison, I just realized that I've listened to 14 consecutive Upside podcasts since finding the show.
Man, that's a heck of a review. That sounds like something that I'd want to read live on our Upside podcast.
That sounds like something that I like to read every morning when I wake up.
Wow, look at us waking up, reading great podcast reviews. If you're a listener and you want to leave a great podcast review, maybe 5 stars, throw a review up on Apple, and we might read your podcast review live here.
Ken, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to chat.
We're excited to have you here. We like to start Upside with a question on the background of the founder. So can you tell us about the history of Ken?
The history of Ken. Ken grew up in a place called Windsor, Ontario in Canada, which is effectively a southern, if you can believe it, southern suburb of Detroit, Michigan. So I grew up in basically effectively the Motor City. My father was a fleet maintenance manager, so he worked in garages with big trucks all his life. I put myself through university by working in those places, and early jobs from I think the age of 14 on working in garages. So I have a lot of experience with the vehicles of the type that we actually work on. My father was an award-winning fleet maintenance manager. He was very good at his job and approached it effectively like a scientist, but he wanted me out of that industry in the worst way. So at one point, he caught me reading his diesel mechanic books and literally took them and got rid of them. Like, you will not be a diesel mechanic. So he encouraged me to and my brother to get out and do something very different than that.
Why?
Go get educated.
Why was that?
It's a hard job, a very hard job. So, as a diesel mechanic, you're working in the shop, strange hours, very hard, dangerous job. Sometimes he would do things that he regrets now. I mean, especially back in the 70s. When he was working on the shop floor, some of the things you were doing would be dangerous for your health, dangerous for your hearing, hurt your back, lifting engines out. It's a hard job. And he graduated over years, started off as a mechanic and moved up to fleet maintenance manager, which it gets you off the shop floor. And like I said, he was very good at it. But simultaneously, it's also a very hard job in that vehicles break down. They break down very frequently. And the problem with that is there's one guy who, when it hits the fan, that's who gets the call. I remember being a kid and we'd be out in the Detroit River on our little boat, like water skiing or something like that, and his beeper would go off and he's like, "Back it in, boys." And that happened a lot. It made him unhappy, right? So he was just like, "Go out, get an education, get out of this, do something that is a real desk job," right? And so, like I said, he encouraged both my brother and I to do that. And my brother turned into a severe weather scientist for Environment Canada. He's the guy who basically chases tornadoes and tells everybody what damage they did, which is fun. And I got out and did computational astrophysics. So I have graduate degrees in computational astrophysics, which means that I did computer modeling simulations of what it's like in the insides of stars, and made predictions about things like cosmology, like how the universe formed using those types of models. So I was, I guess, a really early big data computer geek before the words big data were formed. I was using Linux operating systems to
to tie together distributed systems to solve extremely difficult problems on large data sets, and then comparing it to observables on the stars that are available. Also worked fairly extensively in astronomical instrumentation, which is effectively bridging engineering with this physics side of things and building the camera, the devices that go on the back end of telescopes. So I have a lot of experience in developing hardware for research labs and the like. And I have cameras that I designed and built on research telescopes, like large telescopes all around the world.
Before we head too much down the astronomy path, because I know I'm going to end up there, you mentioned that in the 70s, this was a very dangerous job, this diesel mechanic job. What's that job like today? Is it still, has it evolved? Has it changed? Has anything changed about it?
Boy, has it ever changed. I mean, it's a very interesting question in that it has changed so much. The job of diesel mechanic right now is extremely difficult in a very different way. And it's about who is suited to do the job. At this point, it's effectively become so difficult because of the computer subsystems that are being put on it. These vehicles are getting very, very complex. And you effectively need an engineer, a computer engineer or an electrical engineer to be working on them. So diagnostics have become extremely difficult. The action of doing an oil change, that hasn't changed, right? A lot of the very basic stuff, if you need someone to turn a wrench, there's a lot of people out there who are good at turning wrenches. Diagnostic mechanics right now, there are 40,000 unfilled positions in the US currently, and that's expected to be 400,000 in the next 10 years. And it's just, you cannot pump out these specialists fast enough. So that's actually a problem that we address head on, is how to make better, more efficient use of a really, really tight resource, which is these diagnostic mechanics. So yeah, it's changed a lot. It is a little safer. There's no doubt. Back in the day, my dad, like the brakes that they would be using had these massive springs in them. By massive, I mean like incredibly high amount of force packed into a small thing called a maxi brake. And his job at one point used to be literally cutting those open. Basically, they'd be in a can, like a big cage, and you'd break them open so that they would explode and like blow apart. Lots of danger, basically. And that's also, he used to have to do repairs on the inside of trailers, and you'd be riveting with no ear protection, riveting on the inside of a trailer. You can guess how loud that would be when you're in a closed environment, all made of aluminum, and you're riveting. So yeah, it was not a great thing, and I'm sure that I hope that's improved. People take safety a lot more seriously now. But that said, it's still a really hard back-breaking job. But on top of that, it's something that requires extreme expertise with the tools that are out there today, which look a heck of a lot like a laptop.
So as a kid, what drew you to start down that path to the point that your dad had to say, no, get off that path? What was attractive to you about the industry?
The thing that attracted about the industry is more it turns out, I can look back on it and now realize that it's science. Like what my dad was doing was science. They might have called it like being a mechanic or even with him, fleet maintenance management. But everything that he approached in a scientific manner where he'd break things up into pieces and really solve them in an intelligent way. So, I was always interested in science and engineering, and effectively what he was doing, though it was called something else, was science and engineering. It's all about how you approach the problem. So I saw the way he approached problems, and I thought that is really cool. I want to do that too. And the obvious thing when you're growing up right across from Detroit is you're going to do cars, you're going to do trucks. It's what they do.
So you're going to do cars, you're going to do trucks, and then all of a sudden you're doing astrophysics. How did that switch happen? That seems like a little different.
Yeah, it is not a path that I was expecting either, to be quite honest. High school opened my eyes. I had no idea that I was, how to tell this story. I always thought I was dumb. So growing up, my brother is smart, and he's 2 years older than me, but just 2 years older than me. From a very young age, I grew to be the same size as him. So everybody thought we were twins. Except I was 2 years younger. And when you're 4 or 5 or 6 years old and someone's 2 years older than you, you're pretty dumb, comparatively. So I grew up thinking I was really stupid. And I just never could understand things that my brother could just easily pick up. And it took until I was probably, like late grade school. So, grade 6, grade 7, before I started to recognize that I was actually able to do stuff that other people weren't. It's just, maybe my brother Dave could do it, but, other people weren't able to do it. So I only started to really even understand that I could do interesting stuff a little later.
when I went to high school, I started to get exposed to much deeper maths and sciences, and really was interested in it. It was really good at it. I remember y'all are American, so I should translate grade 9, 10, 11, 12. What is grade 12 here? Senior?
Senior. Yep.
There you go. I remember my senior. I'm a Canadian, just so you understand. We just count. But in my senior year of high school, I remember in my physics classes, the mark on the test would be whatever I got. And strangely enough, people didn't want to kill me. And I don't know how I pulled that one off, but the rest of the class knew this and would still encourage me to do well. And looking back on it, I'm like, why did I not get beaten up?
You were the curve breaker.
Yeah. So they just said, he's not allowed to get above 100%. So whatever he got on the test, we'll make it out of, and then everyone else will be out of that mark. So yeah, I knew I was good at that. But the strange thing is in high school, I was not destined to be a scientist or an engineer or any of that. I was going to be a musician. All my friends were musicians. I did music and I was going to do it professionally. I was a trumpet player and I was very good at it. And that was my thing. And I was heading to university for that. But in my senior year of high school, I had wisdom teeth removed. And for a few years, I lost all feeling in my lower lip because they hit nerves.
Wow.
And so that was the end of that. You can't play trumpet. You can't feel your lip. You can't play trumpet. That simple. So I then was like, okay, what am I doing with my life? And it was as simple as opening, the little books that they send you, or I guess maybe you don't. Back in the day, in my day, they had books. And you read the books, and the books told you what programs were available at a university. Wow. And astrophysics is one of the first things that you open up and you see. So there you go. That's how I ended up doing that.
Tell me more about when that happened. I'm sure it wasn't just okay, well, now what am I going to do with my life? I'm sure that had to have been tough. What was that like?
Not really.
No.
I wish I could say yes. It sounds like it should be, but I don't know why. I pivoted off of that fairly gracefully, and that it was just like, well, that's not going to happen. A lot of my friends actually are professional musicians. They were people that I grew up with and have gone on to do that as a life. I enjoy sharing that with them, and I don't feel like I totally missed the boat on that. It's just a different life path. The life path I'm doing, I'm quite happy with as well. I actually have played semi-professionally. I've toured in bands and stuff and enjoyed that while I was a professor.
Yeah. So you skip over things like anthropology. You still didn't, you didn't pick the first thing in the book. So what was it about astrophysics that you said, yep, this is where I'm stopping in the alphabet?
Well, as I said, it's like I've always been good at science and I always think like a scientist. It's an obvious path for me. I looked at it and I'm like, yeah, we're talking about something that sounds really cool. It's big questions. You're asking and answering really huge questions. And I like that. I really like the idea of thinking big, thinking out of the box and trying to tackle really hard problems. And I had done enough schooling at that point to recognize that astrophysics would be something that would allow me to exercise that portion of my brain. So it seemed obvious to me at that point that it was, okay, let's go for this. It was a real challenge to really go down that path. I had a very, very strong high school, and that sounds like a great thing, but it turns out it actually is a little dangerous. So I know I entered into university and was very, very well prepared in the first year to the point where I really didn't need to develop any study habits whatsoever. And when you're a big fish in a little pond, in other words, you're very much more knowledgeable about what you're taking than all the general population, you can get away with that. But in second year university, when all of a sudden you have a group of 10 people who are majors in astrophysics, and they're all pretty smart, and you've been the sucker who did not develop at all any study habits whatsoever, that's the second year. That was painful.
You mentioned that you left the world of astrophysics. Can you tell us about that decision? Because we kind of got into it. You said that you made a lot of stuff, you worked on some telescopes, you did a lot, and then now you're out of it. So kind of walk me through the process of leaving.
So it was not just like in and then out. So I went off and I did undergraduate degree and then graduate degree in astrophysics, so a master's degree. And I was doing research then on what are called non-radial pulsations of stars. So you examine how vibrations in the outer atmosphere on the convective layer will cause effectively noise. It's a very noisy process. You can think like a jet engine, how loud that is. On the outside of a lot of stars, that's what you're getting.
The music of the cosmos, right?
Exactly. Except you
There you
can't
go.
hear it because there's a lot of nothing between us. So there's nothing to transfer the sound energy to us. But that sets up resonant waves inside it, three-dimensional resonant waves, much like if you and I were holding a skipping rope, we're shaking it up and down. There are certain patterns that form that are stable. You get those three-dimensional patterns around the surface of a star, and you can use that to infer what the density profile is in places that is literally impossible to see inside of a star. So that's the kind of work I was doing research on in my master's. After that, I decided I wanted to get into industry more. Recognize I was brought up in Detroit, so it's always been one of these things where it's like I love being an academic, and then after a few years of it, it's like I can't take this anymore. Can I do something real? So I bugged out and went off and worked in New Haven. Well, I lived in New Haven, Connecticut. I worked in East Hartford, Connecticut, at a company called Advanced Fuel Research, it was a small business that did innovative research. And primarily I was working on two things, which is continuous emission tomography, which is effectively mapping of flames. So you'd be looking at things like the effluent from coal burning plants or from gas burning plants that are making energy, or optionally burning waste product and turning it into energy to optimize based on what the chemical signature is of the effluent, of the exhaust. So I did that, and I also did a type of X-ray spectroscopy that was used for identifying how heavy metal contaminants in DOE and DOD Superfund sites, these are places that the government has polluted beyond all recognition. It's a many billion-dollar problem, and they enlisted us to create techniques to identify how those chemicals are bonded to the soil so they could design more efficient cleaning solutions for getting that or making it not get into the ecosystem effectively. So I bugged out and I worked for that company and did some excellent research there. That was a heck of a lot of fun. And we were building product, right? It was a real neat thing because it's like in the end, you're building a spectrometer or you're delivering a solution. And I did that for several years. And then I was wooed back into doing a PhD of astronomical instrumentation at Ohio State University, where I worked on some of the stuff for the Large Binary Telescope, but also another program where we were designing a set of instruments that would continuously monitor certain types of stars so that you'd be seeing them in multi-channel, so infrared simultaneously with optical around the world at all times. So you had to make sure you had them on multiple telescopes so that as the Earth spun, you'd always be able to be tracking it and seeing it in real time. So I worked on a lot of the back-end systems that were used for that and deployed that. After I finished so that was a really interesting thing because that tied in. So at Advanced Fuel Research, I did a lot of engineering work where I was really building hardware and digging into the software that was running the hardware. So I was kind of an embedded software engineer at that point, plus data science. Right? So everything that I do always kind of pivots on data science, but it's like, what tool do you use to get that data?
And in the late 90s, I'm sure software development looked a lot different than it does today.
Well, I guess it looked a little different. I'll be honest with you, I don't think anything's changed ever. Software is software and programming is programming. And if you ask me what language I use today, the answer is it doesn't even matter. Or what I shouldn't say what developing environment. I use a particular developing environment called Vim, which is kind of esoteric, but that's our whole shop actually uses Vim. We're a little odd in that way because it's not pretty. It looks like it was created in the 70s because it was, but it's still a very, very powerful tool that a lot of people who do take it seriously enjoy working on. Anyways, but like which language it is, and that you're right, it does change. How you tie into things does change, but effectively programming is programming and hardware is hardware, and you're pushing an electron from here to there to figure out which bit to flip. So at some level, nothing's really changed.
So you were at Ohio State at the time, and then you were at Advanced Fuel Research, and then you decided to go and back into research in academia. And then it seems after that you went back into industry with Ericsson. So you kind of have this, you have this ping ponging of, like you said, academia to industry. At some point you've kind of, today you've returned to this trucking industry with Preteckt. Help us close the gap there and tell us how that came about.
Yeah. So I had worked as a professor at a research university in Canada for, I think it was 9 years, all told. And for the last few of those years, every year at the end of it, I would go into the department chair and say, okay, I'm resigning this year. I'm going to go off and do something else, because my intent was no more than 3 to 5 years being a prof. That is just, I like going back to my roots and doing industry stuff. At the end of 5 years, there was this constant back and forth of, okay, I'm moving on now. And they're like, well, how about if we do this for you?
How about we can make this easier? We can make this map into your life. I had young kids at the time, so like the flexibility of being able to schedule things around, when I had to pick up my daughter and stuff like that was it was convenient. It was a good job. They treated me like gold. They gave me carte blanche to design courses from scratch and gave me really interesting courses to work with. Historically, I'm a bit of a showman. I literally have gone on stage with a rock band and played for 30,000 people. I know how to have fun with an audience, and they wanted to bring that into the classroom more. So they gave me literally carte blanche to take they had one course that they were teaching that was for first year physicists, if you will, that are not physicists. They hate physics. They never wanted to take this, but they're being forced to. And courses get evaluated at the end every year, and students tell you how much it sucks. And this one was a failing grade. Every year, everyone hated it. It would literally get a failing grade from students. Unfortunately, it was the largest course. So every year, physicists are training people to hate physics. And those people go out and they make decisions in the world like, hey, should we fund physics? So it's not really wise to let that continue. So they said, you know what, go out there. I'm a good teacher, so I can actually make people understand things, but find a way to connect with these students. And within 1 year, we had raised that from our failing grade, worst course we ever taught, to our top scoring course. No change in outcomes. People still understood exactly what they understood before, but it was being driven to them in a way that really resonated with them. Anyways, I really enjoyed that, but at the end of it, I started getting the itch again and saying I needed to do something. And it honestly didn't start quite the way I was expecting it to. Preteckt started as a small weekend type project that I was just going to have some fun. I have graduate degrees in electrical and computer engineering, so I know how to make hardware. I understand data science. And someone came to me with an idea for something that would allow you to hook into the port on your car that would take the data from the car when it has a check engine light go on, would take that data and then send information to a dealership that would say, hey, you should order this part and schedule 3 hours for this particular thing. And that wasn't interesting to me because that really was more app development, not data science. So I said no, but that early co-founder came to me again and again and again. He was very pushy, which is good. That's what you want in an early co-founder. Anyways, so that's Peter Bassa, and he kept on pushing me to think about this. And eventually I thought about it enough that I realized that there was a data science problem that was unsolved. And it was really interesting because I started acquiring data off of it just to get a sense of what was going on that computer bus, the data bus that's in a vehicle. And I started realizing, like, you'd Google it, it's like, oh, well, someone else is taking this data and doing data science. And you'd Google, you'd try to find, it's like, who is doing this? And no one was doing it. And it boggled my mind that there was a huge untapped data source. And it was just, that data was evaporating. You can't unevaporate data. You can't go backwards in time and say, oh, we should have been taking that. So let's just have taken that, right? So anyways,
I see.
I finally said to that Peter Bassa, I was like, you know what? If you're interested in pivoting this company into a data science company, I'm down for doing this. And so we started working on that early concept at the end of 2014, just taking some initial data, doing some initial prognostics on it, on vehicles, like my car, his car, some friends and families type thing. And very quickly started to have predictive success on the data that was coming off of that.
I just wanted to add a quick aside. I see you have a 4.5 on Rate My Professors, so it does seem that you made that accessible for the students.
And some chili peppers, or did they remove those now?
I think they're gone now, unfortunately. You used to have them?
The chili peppers.
Oh, yeah,
that's hurtful.
How do you define data science? I feel like there's so many of these words that are getting thrown around right now, like data science, machine learning, AI. I feel like everyone has them in some pitch book. So how do you define data science? And then we can kind of move on from there.
Yeah, I define data science this almost the same way I would define science. It's effectively like we're taking data and, like, very specifically, what was I talking about? Talking about taking data off of a car, right? And what the car has is typically a couple hundred sensors that are measuring temperatures and pressures and torques and vibrations at times all around a vehicle. And it's a bunch of disparate data points, but you're trying to make a picture, right? You're trying to make a model. And the second you're trying to turn the sensors into a sense of what's going on, a context, that's doing science. And if you're using data, that's data science. So, like, I have a very loose definition of data science because, to me, I've been doing data science for a very long time.
right? All of the positions that I've ever worked on are using data to make inferences about something in the real world. And that's data science. And, initially we would call that producing a physical model. These days you use physical models as well as statistical models, but also this cool new thing called machine learning models, which are just statistics. Let's not get confused. Everyone's using these terms like they're magic. They're not. It's just a really, really interesting way of building a statistical model that can take in a ton of data and make sense of it in a way that a human would have a real hard time visualizing. And that's what we do. So I never sell us as an AI company, because artificial intelligence to me there's a very specific definition of what artificial intelligence is. And that's about creating an autonomous intelligence that can think like a human and interact with you in such a way that you believe you're interacting with a human. We use machine learning, which is a type of statistical technique that will allow us to take a lot of data, and from that data and inputs about labels as to what the outputs of those data is, when it all happens together, what does that mean? If you label it in that way, you can learn from those patterns.
So how would you describe what Preteckt does today?
Preteckt delivers vehicle prognostics as a service to OEMs and fleets. So what that basically means is we predict when check engine lights are going to go on, sometimes months in advance. We do that using raw sensor data. And it's not thresholding. So recognizing when a vehicle is built these days, whether it's a small vehicle or a large vehicle, it makes no difference. The OEM, the manufacturer of the vehicle, specs out all the subcomponents separately. Like they're talking to one company to make a starter and another company to build a power steering pump, another one to do the AC system, right? And then all of those things come together and get squished into a box and sent onto the road. Those interactions are where we come in, right? We understand holistically how they come together and how they interact with each other, so that when you have a subsystem manufacturer whose job it is to understand a power steering pump, they deeply understand that power steering pump. But all that they can say is, okay, if it goes out of spec, if it's too hot or too cold, or if it is, the pressure is here, over here, or over there. So here's my box for my power steering pump. But unless you know what the rest of the vehicle is doing, and unless you know, okay, but how about when it's doing this, right? If it's at idle, that box changes, right? At idle, it's a tiny little box over here. Whereas if it's a dump truck and it has it's lifting its gate up, it's up here. So they have to make a big box for each subsystem that are all the possible ways that this thing could behave before they throw a diagnostic trouble code, a check engine light, right? But what we are able to do is define these little boxes based on all of the other boxes simultaneously. All the different parameters come together and form a picture of the context of the vehicle. We provide that context and we make sense of it.
How is that integrated into the vehicle to start? Do they have to put that into the vehicle when they manufacture it, or is that something that you can plug in later? Can you get it over the air?
The answer is yes to all of those things. So it depends on who you're working with. When we're working with a manufacturer, like a General Motors, for instance, they have their own ability to acquire data. So they have their own path. In GM's case, that's OnStar. That data would come into their cloud, and they could use our back end that we've developed, our architecture that supports the machine learning. They could use that to provide better vehicle health management to their customers. So they'd own the input and the output side. With our fleet customers, some of our fleet customers, they will use our hardware. We actually have hardware that you can install directly onto the vehicle, in under a few minutes. It's very easy. So they install the hardware, and then it pumps that data into our back end via the cloud, and then goes straight out to a web dashboard that goes to their fleet maintenance manager. So it depends on the customer. Some customers we have end to end. Other customers is just the core of our technology. And some have one end and not the other.
You mentioned that you guys can predict, in some cases, months in advance, a check engine light coming on. What else? I mean, this is a lot of data. So what else can you predict? And what else, what are the other outcomes, I guess?
I guess what else would you want me to predict? Our focus in life is making sure that there is no downtime. I guess there's two foci now. So it's interesting. We entered into it. Our vision going into this was that we were going to eliminate unplanned downtime for vehicles. And we can't, for the most part, keep a vehicle from breaking. Right? They're going to get old, they're going to break. But what we can do is tell you when it's going to happen so that you can be prepared for that and get ahead of it and not have it break down on the side of the road. Right? It's like, this will break down in 3 weeks. As it's driving by the next time, we're going to fix that part and
make sure it doesn't break down. Right? That was our original thesis. And we do that. And we do that across many different subsystems on a vehicle. So whether it's being the charging system, your cylinders, the after treatment system, the emissions control system, all these different things are something that we're simultaneously covering. But it turns out that it's not just the fact that we're preventing downtime, that we're catching this beforehand and therefore, saving them both the road call, but also the downstream damage. When one part breaks, oftentimes there's a chain reactions of things that get out of whack that cause damage downstream. So we save a lot of money on that. But it turns out that one of the other benefits that we have is decreasing the amount of diagnostic time that it takes a fleet to evaluate what the problem is and act on it in the garage. And that's actually a really interesting part of our machine learning strategy. And it wasn't where we started. When I started the company, mentally I was like, machine learning, that's going to hit the home run, right? It's a black box. We can just use these things and it's going to magically solve all of our problems wondrously. And a lot of people are still believing that's the case. And we've learned it's not. But the first 2 years of our R&D, if you will, where we're taking data and really designing that back end to support prognostics, we had the idea that if you had enough data and you had the right models, you could just predict everything with 100% certainty. And it doesn't work with the current state of the art. And it's not just us. We know it doesn't work. Oftentimes I'll talk to, there was one truck manufacturer who I got on the phone with. I've talked to them on and off for years now. He's the head of the innovation department there. He got on the phone with me. He's like, I'm going to tell you, this is going to be a very aggressive call. I've had so many people blowing smoke up my ass over the last years about this ML stuff, solving it, and none of it works. And I'm like, oh, yeah, you're right. It doesn't. So, here's where we're different. And, number one, we take boatloads of data. No one else is taking that kind of data. And honestly, garbage in equals garbage out. That's a fundamental tenet of science, right? So you have to take great data. And so we entered this as a data science program, right? Like to me, I'm a data scientist. The first thing was, how do I get great data? And since we couldn't find anybody who had a piece of hardware that would give us great data, it's like, we're making that piece of hardware now. We do not want to make that hardware. That is not our dream. Our dream is on the back end, right? But you got to have great data. So that's one way that we differentiate ourselves. But the other way is really about how we learned machine learning. So like I said, when we started out, we had this linear path of generate data, do machine learning, output to the customer. And the problem is you can either output too much to the customer, because what you're catching is multivariate anomalies, which are saying, here's 1,000 sensors and something weird's going on with one of them. It doesn't fit the rest of them. You're out of pocket, right? And if you send that to your customer, often you're going to be wrong. And with a fleet customer, if you send it off to a commercial fleet and they're like, okay, well, there's a problem, pull it in. That just costs them money. And if you pull it in, they're like, there's nothing wrong with this vehicle. You just burnt that bridge and lost that customer. They'll maybe let you get away with 1 or 2 of those, but it's a big deal. So then what people are doing is optimizing to reduce the number of false positives, right? Unfortunately, that means you're missing all kinds of stuff. So there's no real winning right now with that strategy. So what we're doing is we have a 2-stage process where the first stage is we use the multivariate anomaly detection using physical models, statistical models, and machine learning to put those anomalies in front of a human. So we have our own expert who reviews using our data tools, all the historical data for that vehicle and all vehicles like it, and has access to the real-time data on the vehicle right now. They can perform any tests that they need to do, just like it's in the shop. So we have all those potential false positives going through a human, having that human inject their intelligence into it and provide a label, right? So they're going to label it as, is it cautionary? Is it useless? Is this something? Ignore this. Is it cautionary? As in, that's going to be a problem in a few months, high, severe, critical, or this thing's about to break down, right? So they label it for severity and also do a root cause analysis. So if it's a problem, like a severe or critical problem, and this is the part, and this is why it's that part, right? With all the data to back it up. We have a 2-stage process. The first one is multivariate anomaly detection. The second is human in the loop. And we have a whole separate section of machine learning that's dedicated to watching how that human interacts with the data to improve the efficiency of that human's interaction so that we can get our KPI, which is number of vehicles per technician, way up into the stratosphere.
Is that human that is checking that, is that a Preteckt human, or is that someone at the shop checking the truck and you have tools for them to put that tag on and send it to you and you trust them to do that?
Great question. And the answer is both. So we have our own human that checks all this stuff and injects we're really codifying his brain and jamming that into our machine learning, which is terrific because he's really good. But we also work with partners to have their experience come in. So when we're working with OEMs, for instance, or tier one suppliers, they understand, let's say, their power steering pump better than anybody. We have a great relationship with Bridgestone, for instance. We've been working with them for a while, and we have a multi-year contract with them now. They understand tires deeply, better than we do. There's no doubt. They have expertise in tires, but we have expertise in contextualizing the tires and really understanding, what makes a good predictive model for wear and failure. So we work with them. They inject their expertise into our back end, and we learn from that and train and get the models better. So it depends on which customer.
Do the models change based on the type of vehicle?
The models do change based on the type of vehicle. You have to take that into account as one of the variables. That said, you'd be surprised how similar they are. We were working with the Memphis Area Transit Authority, which is the first bus that we installed on. We'd only worked on long-haul vehicles up to that point. So we're working on a very different use case vehicle, so a different utility class. And we warned the Memphis Area Transit Authority, MATA, that chances are it's going to take us a few months to train models because we've never done a bus. We have no idea what buses are going to look like. But they're like, we need you to solve this problem, so let's go. Within the first week, we had predicted something that was going to fail. They brought it in, and they're like, yep, you got it. So we won them very quickly because we were using models for vehicles that are completely different, but there's enough similarities in the context of how a vehicle is being used and certain subsystems that very quickly you're able to make value for a customer out of what you've already learned.
The hardware that you mentioned earlier, that hardware is specialized to clean the data. I didn't really understand the link between the hardware and getting great data.
So on a vehicle, there is a network. It's a local internet, if you will, that connects together a whole bunch of engine computer units. Each engine computer unit controls a subsystem. So for instance, the emissions control system might have several ECUs, engine control units, that each one of those has several sensors hanging off of it and is using that information and transmitting it back and forth between other components on that network to make sure that the whole vehicle is operating together simultaneously. So what we do is we tap into that local area network and both sniff and pull. So, but for the most part, sniff. We take the data that's already being chatted around there and send that to the cloud. So quality data, don't even think about it as pre-processing. It's how many of those messages are you actually grabbing? It's a lot of messages. So we're taking between 1 and 5 gigabytes of data compressed per vehicle per month. When you're looking at a standard telematics solution, it's about 1,000 times less than that because they're looking at, okay, did a check engine light just pop on? If so, let's take the 30 seconds and before and after that and kind of take that little chunk of data and send it off. But to us, if you want to predict something more than 30 seconds in advance, you need the data that happened more than 30 seconds in advance. So we're taking all that data constantly, permanently, and storing it. It's been a very successful technique for us to be able to get precursor data to failures.
How many vehicles is the Preteckt system on now?
The Preteckt hardware is installed on hundreds of vehicles, but our back end has been used on tens of thousands of vehicles.
And when your back end is used, are you still storing all of that data, that 1 to 5 gigabytes per vehicle per month?
It depends. When the back end is used, we're using typically data that has been ingested from another source, like a telematics service provider. So some of them have very poor quality data, and that makes it harder to use, and some of them have good quality data, which makes it easier to use. The nice thing is we've seen things with laser vision. Like we've seen an extremely good picture of what is actually happening. So after you've seen that picture, it makes it so that you can now look at someone else's poor picture and go, oh yeah, but I know what that means, right? But you have to have the clear picture first before you can build a model that can work with poor data.
So I get why OEMs probably didn't have this to start. They were probably excited about making the data and maybe didn't have the experience of the prioritization to start predicting it in-house. Is there a threat to Preteckt of OEMs saying we're going to do this analytics within our own systems in the coming future? Or is that actually kind of an exit strategy for you guys?
It's both. There's always a threat. You have to recognize that it's not just us that feels the threat, though. It's every OEM. Everyone right now is fearful for their life of being disrupted out of existence tomorrow. You see massive companies right now pivoting, making huge pivots. Look at General Motors, right? Really deciding we're not doing that anymore. We're doing this. That's a big company to be making those kind of decisions. So disruption's in the air. Everyone's scared. And that actually works for and against us. I mean, it does mean that some OEM is undoubtedly working on this. But what we've found is they're looking at us and saying, yeah, but we need to win this and we need to win it yesterday, and you're 4 years ahead. So how about we work together on this? So we've had a lot of interest from OEMs, more interest than we can manage right now. So we've actually gotten to the point now where we have to hire dramatically in order to support what's in our pipeline of great customers coming in, such as OEMs.
Yeah, it seems like you're kind of in a picks and shovel situation with autonomous vehicles where I'm guessing your hardware and software does not become obsolete when vehicles become autonomous.
Actually, we love autonomy because one of the primary modes of feedback for maintenance right now on a vehicle is the driver. The driver's like, something's not right here. It doesn't feel right. I don't have the power I used to. There's a vibration. There's a noise. It smells wrong. Hey, it's on fire. As soon as you go to autonomous, you can literally, like, imagine for a moment, if you don't have a driver, you don't have to stop the vehicle, right? So you could load something up at a port on the East Coast in Maine and drive it continuously all the way to LA, right? And you don't have to pull over because you don't have a driver restricted on number of hours. And it's very easy to put just bigger fuel tanks on there. So it could be leaving Maine, have a problem, and be on fire by the time it's in Vermont, and you don't know, right? So the neat thing about autonomy is that as we get closer to solving that problem, what we've seen is as OEMs are like, oh, whoa, hey, we've almost solved this. This is a real thing. This is going to happen. They're like, but we haven't even thought about how to do predictive diagnostics on it, and we're removing the driver. So all of a sudden, there's a bunch of red flags going up, going, oh, hey, who does this? So in the last year, we've had a lot of inbound interest from OEMs who are the ones that are close to solving this problem because they recognize that they have to have solved predictive diagnostics before they can launch autonomous vehicles.
When you say OEMs, I would just like to clarify who that is. Is that, you mentioned GM a couple times. Yep. It seems like we're talking about like the 18-wheelers that you see on the highway. Are we talking about more than that? Are we talking about, is this like Peterbilt, Navistar? Who is this?
Yeah. So OEMs. Cummins would be a type of OEM in that they make an engine. They don't have an actual vehicle itself. But so Cummins would be an OEM in my mind. But obviously Navistar would be another one. Freightliner would be another one that's owned by Daimler. We work with Daimler through Thomas Built Buses, which is also owned by Daimler. General Motors is an OEM. Now, General Motors does not make heavy duty vehicles. So we work with them on their passenger vehicles. But so you can map out the Nissan, Subaru, Toyota, Ford. Those are all OEMs. And then, if you're getting on the other side of the space, when you're getting into heavier duty vehicles, you're talking about Freightliner and Volvo and Kenworth and PACCAR. So those are all OEMs. We would call Bridgestone, even though they're a manufacturer, they manufacture a subsystem effectively. And so in that way, we would call them a tier one supplier.
On the other side of the customers, you mentioned fleets. How would you define that? Because that's a little more of a fragmented space, right?
So fleet space is really interesting in that. So our definition of a fleet is, hey, you own more than one vehicle. That's a fleet. And interestingly enough, it's a long tail problem on the short side in that most fleets are small fleets. So the majority of fleets are 20 vehicles and under. And you get a lot of vehicles in super fleets, but most vehicles that are in fleets are not in super fleets. We, as a company, are targeting the large fleets, like the fleets that are having 200 and up vehicles. So that's the area that we're targeting because the cost of sales makes sense for us. But we can also target 200 and lower through providing our back-end service to telematics service providers who already have figured out the path to market there. They have a channel for selling to smaller fleets. So all they have to do, so almost every telematics service provider, and in North America, all of those all commercial vehicles are connected at this point, and legally they have to be for the ELD, the electronic logging devices. So there's now a pathway to data that almost always has the ability to do an over-the-air update to change what data is being sent to the cloud. So we can enter into a partnership with any ELD manufacturer or provider, as well as any telematics provider, to say, okay, you want to deliver this type of prognostic to your customer? Send us, these 15 variables sampled at these different frequencies, and ingest that into our backend, and we can send you a flag that says, hey, this is going to be a problem in 2 weeks, and you can send that to your customer. So when we're targeting smaller fleets, we're targeting it through channels such as that.
So we've talked a lot about the different types of customers and the different types of vehicles they have. You mentioned earlier that the buses was something that you had to kind of on-ramp to. Are there other areas that you would need to on-ramp into right now, like heavy-duty Caterpillars type stuff, or smaller, like sedans? Like, are those different enough that you would need that on-ramp time as well? Or are those even targets at all?
They're currently not targets, but they are targets for the future. Certainly, we've had a lot of interest from passenger vehicle manufacturers as well, and passenger vehicle fleets, rental car companies, for instance. We've had a lot of interest from heavy duty manufacturers, everything from the cranes. There's an awful lot of interest in that space. Anything that has a lot of downtime. So if you look at mining equipment, downtime is exceedingly expensive, and it's effectively the same kind of thing, but it's a different use case.
Ken, you mentioned a couple of customers, one being super fleets that sounds like you're selling your hardware to. The second being telematics company that sounds like you're selling the software to. Are those your two main customer segments at this point?
Add into that the manufacturers. So actually, most of our revenue right now is driven by manufacturers. So large contracts with OEMs and tier one suppliers.
Can you describe that model then with those three different types of customers?
I have to be careful about describing models with those types of customers because they're much more sensitive to us describing the model with those types of customers. But recognize that when you're working with a manufacturer, they're trying to improve the way that they're delivering predictions to their end customers. When you're talking about someone who would make a subsystem, like a battery, for instance, they would be perhaps thinking about how to move their service from selling a battery to someone to instead of that selling the service of a battery to someone so that they know I will always have a battery that's going to work in my vehicle, and it just costs me $5 a month. I no longer think about the fact that I have to go get one every 3 months, or hey, I'm driving in these conditions. So we work with manufacturers and tier one suppliers to really help them understand when is something going to fail. How do you model your business around selling that as a service instead, and then give them the tools that they would need to be able to make sure that things aren't failing for those customers who they're providing service to.
So how do you think about the market ahead of Preteckt then? Because it sounds like any one of those three customer segments are pretty large markets in and of themselves. So help me quantify what this could look like if Preteckt just goes gangbusters.
Yeah. So our path in the near term, so 2019, we're really focused on there's a particular KPI that will set us on fire, if you will, which is the number of vehicles per technician that are being used in our back end. So this human in the loop. The industry standard is that you'll have about 25 vehicles per technician in your fleet. We're already up above 250 vehicles per technician, which means that that's great. We want to be up above 1,000 before we start pushing into the commercial vehicles, such like massive fleets, like Penskes and Riders. You have great unit economics at that point, so it makes a lot of sense for us to really launch big time into those fleets. The way to get there is to do great data science. And strangely enough, the best data science is not done with the commercial fleets, because a commercial fleet, if you tell them there's a problem, they will go out and fix it that day. Just done. Which makes it hard to do data science because you don't get to see what actually happened. We love working with municipal fleets. And for the same reason that municipal fleets have a really hard time, which is they're resource constrained. They never have the resources to act on everything we send them. So they can only act on the highest priority thing that we send them. So if we send them a cautionary, we know it's going to get ignored. And we get to track it and say, that cautionary got worse. It is now high. And that cautionary, it got worse again. It's now severe. We really need to be talking about fixing this. So that, as a data science accelerator, is terrific. So in 2019, we are really pushing hard on the municipal side, growing into municipal fleets, primarily public transit. We also work on school buses, for instance. You have to recognize that the vehicles themselves, even though they are buses, the engines, the power units for those are designed not to work in those type of utility cases. Right? They're designed for long haul transport. They're shoehorned inside of a bus. So they also fail more frequently, but in the same ways. So they expand our contextual space, if you will. And we really understand deeply a lot more about the prognostics, and then we can use that to improve the number of vehicles that we're handling per technician. So our path in 2019 is to work with a few top-notch commercial fleets while simultaneously growing on the municipal side to really ramp up that KPI. 2020, we'll be launching into scaling into the commercial fleets. And the whole while we're pumping the gas here and really making sure that we're doing well by maintaining and growing our relationships with a bunch of OEMs and tier one suppliers. Because everyone wants to know that you're working with everyone. We provide context. So the OEMs want to know that you have fleet data and you have great relationships on the fleet side so that they can understand how the vehicles are being used. And the fleets are like, oh, you work with the experts here on this subsystem. So yeah, I'm having a problem with that subsystem. Let's talk about that. So you really have to kind of solve the problem simultaneously.
What is the pricing model for Preteckt? Is it per vehicle, per month, SaaS type fee? Is it how does it work, and does it change on a customer by customer basis?
It's a per vehicle per month, and it does change based on whether or not you're using our hardware or you're providing your own data stream, or even if you own the customer, right? So if it's telematics service provider and they're only using our back end and they're doing API injection of data and API output of the prognostics, that really reduces the cost of us providing that service. So for that type of, where they're just using our back end engine, that's a licensing fee.
Help me understand the costs a little bit. It sounds like data storage is going to be a huge part of it. You obviously have some really smart people on your team, so I'm guessing those salaries are big. But what else is driving cost?
Data storage actually drives almost zero cost.
Really?
Yes. We really think of that as a zero. We store everything and it's effectively free. If you store it sensibly, it's effectively free. So we really kind of turn the whole thing on its head. And instead of looking at what the costs are, we primarily focus on the value that we're delivering and trying to improve that dramatically. So we just completed a multi-month, it was four-month POC pilot project with a major commercial transport company, and showed on their own internal analysis, which is important. It's not us just kind of spitballing and saying, hey, we did this. We worked for them. We sent them all the data, all the prognostics. They did their own deep dive analysis and showed that we were saving them on average almost $3,000 per vehicle per year. So to us, the fact that it costs us around $15 per month for the data for cellular connection. So this is all real time. So we're transporting it or cell. That's a lot of money. And that is so much money that a typical telematics service provider, that would break their model for delivery, right? But for us, being the ones who are really defining that back end and understand the prognostics, we're concentrating on the big side so that we can go off to other partners, such as telematics service providers or OEs, and say, look, this is how much money is sitting out there untapped. Give us these chunks and we can deliver this fraction of it to you. So for data costs on our side, if they're using our hardware is expensive. I hate hardware. But we have to amortize that over the contract. And that's an expensive piece of it. The data costs are expensive because we do send a lot of data over there. We do expect to be optimizing that substantially using both lossless and lossy techniques over the course of the next year to drive the margins a little bit better. But we're a small team still, 10 people. We have to be very, very careful with where we're assigning those people, right? Because you're right, they're expensive, smart people. And I could either say, hey, develop a better model that'll take that $3,000 to $5,000, or I can say, hey, the same smart person, take my cost down from $15 to $12. And I know which one of those two things I'd rather have them focus on. So we've always ignored margins and looked at that big picture side where it's like we can create boatloads of value.
At $3,000 per vehicle per year saved, how big is the pie? How big is what you can save for these companies?
Absolutely. So for the municipal fleets in North America, so actually I should quantify that as Canada and the US, the total addressable market just on municipal is 500 million. The total addressable market in the USA and Canada for commercial fleets is over 10 times that, so $5 billion. As soon as you go into the global market, obviously you're getting multiples on that rather dramatically. And we are starting to go into the global market. We are working with companies that are in Japan and China already to bring this to market there. So there's a lot of value that's sitting out there waiting to be tapped.
So Ken, I saw on your LinkedIn that you built the prototype from what I can tell, and you were the CTO at the start, and now you're the CEO. What was that transition?
The transition occurred at the end of 2016, beginning of 2017. What we found was that our early stage CEO, who was really, really good at getting everyone excited and on board, very good at establishing relationships with small fleets, we got to the point where we're starting to speak to a lot of large fleets. We were driving like a big interest. So large fleets and OEMs. So when you're talking to them, they're expecting talk to the person who really deeply understands the product. You have to be able to communicate to their very excellent engineers why you're solving it and they weren't able. So what we found was it was required for me to be bridging from CTO into CEO, because I was the person who really could communicate the vision for what the company can do and how it can do it. Fundamentally, I came into this having never done a business before. This is my first startup. When we first moved down to Memphis, Tennessee, where the company was headquartered, and started our first business accelerator, which is StartCo, I was a bit of a snowflake. kind of difficult to deal with in that I said very specifically, the rules of engagement are very simple. I will work on this so long as I never once have to speak to a customer or an investor. And if you make me do that, I quit. So yeah, I would fire me right now, but it is what it is. So it took a long time for me to get comfortable to the point where, as an academic, I recognized what sales actually was when you're doing it right. And sales right now is me connecting with people who are really excited about the thing that we're making. And I can do that all day and all night because I love what we're making and I know what it can do. And so if I'm talking to people who get it and are like, I want that thing, how do we do it? I love that process. So when I realized that that sales is not a selling someone something that they don't want. When it's, hey, I made this for you to solve your problem and you have a big problem, buddy. I bridged that gap. And so around that same time that we were moving into larger customers where I was talking to people who understood that they needed this product was around the same time that I was like, okay, yeah, I can do this.
Did that cause any internal conflict?
I mean, we did change CEOs and our initial co-founder is not with us anymore. So the answer to that is it caused some internal reorganization. So we're still working with that co-founder. He is still has equity and he's very much a cheerleader for us. But yeah, I mean, it caused a significant reorganization at that point. But we all understood that for the company to grow to that next phase, we had to reorganize. We had to get on the right path.
Talk to me about the decision to headquarter in Memphis. You're Canadian. You were up there as a professor right before this, and now you're down in Memphis, Tennessee. I don't have the natural bridge.
So the natural bridge is StartCo. StartCo is a business accelerator that's based in downtown Memphis, Tennessee, and there's two reasons for Memphis. Number one, it's a logistics hub. It's the very center of the states. So you have all the East Coast stuff coming into the middle and all the West Coast stuff coming to the middle. It's a huge intermodal for shipping. So a huge center for intermodal shipping. So their access to customers, if you want to talk about the number of fleets that we can touch within 20 minutes, it's insane. So we were sold on this. We were up in the Toronto, Canada area developing this. All three founders are from that area. And StartCo found us and said, hey, we're interested in this product and we have a market for you. We were looking at passenger vehicles. They're like, ignore that. You don't want to be doing that. We have a much deeper pain for you to solve, and it's in the commercial trucking space. And they have ties into it. They were able to introduce us to their network to give us access to those early customers who had to take a big bet on us, because when we came down here, we really had very little, right? You need data to do data science, and we had never been installed on a truck. You have to get someone who's buying on spec the potential for this system, and StartCo really helped us with that.
We had Katie on the show recently. I think I know that's who introduced us. That's wild to me that they found you in the early stages of what you were doing. Do you have any insight into how they were able to find you at the early stage and matchmake you to what they had access to in Memphis?
Yeah, so we were part of a Google Next entrepreneurship program in the Toronto area. And the managing director of StartCo at the time, Mara Lewis, knew about that program and was always out scoping things. So they're very good here. They know they're in the middle of the country and that they know they have to go places and really find talent. So they're always shopping at anything that's a real interesting event where, interesting startups are coming too. So they're out there, with the ear to the ground. They found us there and they immediately engaged us and said, hey, we can do this. We can make this work for you. We haven't regretted it. It's been very successful for us.
Is there any piece of data that is not currently collected on vehicles that you think would be incredibly insightful to have? Like, is there a sensor that is not currently best practice to have?
Yes, but the thing is, it's already coming. It's so close. So there's one company, I'm not going to name names here. There are companies right now that are just releasing products that are going to solve that. And what it is vibration analysis on the wheel hub. So if you look at where you connect your wheel to, not the tire goes on the wheel goes on the wheel hub, putting a vibration sensor there that's connected to a connected device. So it doesn't have to directly be connected to the cell, but something that would, let's say Bluetooth or Wi-Fi into a hub, like ours, let's say, and then take that data off to the cloud. That is the holy grail. You can do so much with that vibration data and that's stuff that is not currently on the CAN bus, this local area network that connects everything. All the running gear is separate and it breaks down constantly. So this is very exciting for us in that we're working with Bridgestone on tire wear models, and we know full well that that vibration data has value from rubber all the way up through the brakes, the wheel hubs themselves, because when wheel hubs fail, that is a 500 kilograms, so 1,000-pound payload that's being hurled into space at very high speeds, very deadly. And this happens. So, you can predict when the wheel hub fails all the way up the axle, U-bolts, transmissions. You get a whole new window on that. So yeah, that's coming down the pipeline, and it's big news. It's really going to make a difference to what can be predictively modeled.
This has been awesome, Ken. Last question for me. Your dad worked so hard to get you out of the trucking space, and here you are back in it. How do you feel about that?
It's funny because I'm in it and I'm not in it. I don't really know. It was a really hilarious thing when I moved down to Memphis, Tennessee, and I think it was in June of 2015. I had Preteckt unit, our first one that we're installing in a truck, Preteckt unit in hand, standing in a garage in Memphis, Tennessee, a truck garage. And I took a picture, a little selfie, and sent it to my dad saying, how did I get here? Because it looked just like his garage. Standing, behind me was a truck that looked just like one of his trucks. And it's like, I'm right back in. So yeah, it's a big twist, but simultaneously it's an interesting twist on it in that, and I love this actually. It's just, when I said my dad's good, he's really, really good at what he does. He is a very, very intelligent scientist when it comes to what's going on in an engine. And there are still times, and this is the last time I've really called on him was within the last year, where we'll get a really strange set of data. It's like, what is going on here? And when it really comes down to it, and I need help, and like there's just no one else to call on. He's retired, and honestly, when his mind gets worrying, he just dives in. And but every once in a while, I'll call him up, and I'm like, okay, let me share my screen with you. This is what we're seeing.
That's awesome.
He'll spin his wheels for about 15 minutes, and then come back to me and like, I've got it. This is what it is. But then he's so excited that for the next week, I'm like, and I also thought about this and this and this and this and this. So it's like, you're retired. Calm down. Just go record some music. He's also a musician.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Ken. If people want to learn more about you or about Preteckt after the show, where should they go?
www.preteckt.com. That's preteckt.com.
All right, Eric, we just spoke with Ken Sills of Preteckt. Where do you want to start? Where do you want to start this deal memo? You want to talk about the opportunity? You want to talk about Ken as a founder?
I think we should take this back to a more classic upside deal memo. And let's start with the founder. Let's start with Ken. I was impressed. That's my first take. I'm not even going to ask you for yours. I'm going to take the floor here. I was very impressed with Ken from a intellectual standpoint. You could tell that he had been converted almost to this idea as well, which I really enjoyed. He didn't come on board thinking that this was going to be something that was going to be the next 10 years of his life. And once he got into the actual problem, he was like, all right, now I've been converted, which I think is like very disproving a hypothesis, scientific method kind of stuff, which I really like. And just overall, I was very impressed by Ken. What do you think?
Totally agree in that I love when people understand something so well that they can take a very complex idea and break it into very simple terms so that anybody can understand. And throughout the interview, Ken was super, super good at that. He was able to read our reactions and, sort of physical responses on the video and tailor the way he was explaining pretty complex things to us in such a simple way that you have to really, really understand something to be able to do that. He's obviously incredibly smart. His background in astrophysics, mostly just out of interest in science and curiosity, that bleeds through into what he's doing here with Preteckt. As you said, it didn't seem like he was necessarily looking to join a company and really do this thing, but was convinced otherwise, had the stipulation of, okay, as long as I don't need to talk to a single customer or investor. But in talking with Ken, he's got to be the person doing that. I mean, he really understands the product. He understands the problem. He has a background in the industry, and he's able to get that across to, I think, just about anybody in the way that he explains it.
What do you think about this idea that they don't use the standard softwares, the standard languages? He said that they used a product called Vim.
Yeah, I forget exactly what Vim is or how it works. It's not really the language it's a way of doing coding. When I've worked with developers in the past, in my product management background, we were not using Vim, but we were using, I think you mentioned Python, and we use that quite a bit because that is much easier to program from a statistical and mathematical standpoint. So I love when a founder comes on and says, I built this prototype. And, it sounds like Ken has been teaching himself how to code for a long time. The way that he approached machine learning and data science, he says, data science is just statistics. This is actually kind of a pattern we heard at CES this year too, as people the pendulum swinging the other way from AI and machine learning and big data as just like cool big buzzwords, but moving towards the practical application of, okay, if we have these things, what does it actually mean for the end user and how do we make that useful? And it's clear that he's on that side of the argument as well.
Yeah, the reason I bring up Vim is it sounds like it's something that isn't very widely known, which brings up a bit of a shadow and a bit of a opportunity in my head. If you bring on some engineering talent and they're used to Python or Rails or whatever else, I don't really even know the competitors of Vim, but how easy is it to learn it? He mentioned it was a bit archaic, or it was a bit, I forget what the word he used. Does that make it harder to recruit people in a place that it's already kind of hard to recruit people? The thing that's beneficial about using a non-mainstream technology is that you have a competitive advantage over your competitors. Amazon famously did all of their internal communications on their own. They built out their own infrastructure, and it sucked for a while and people hated it. But because of that, they were able to figure out things that sucked about hosting websites and messaging and all the other problems that led to them creating AWS. So I think that there are some shadows about building on a niche system and some potential opportunities.
I believe Vim is just where people are doing the actual writing of code. So you could do this in a text document a lot of times. A lot of people use Sublime because it will color code certain actions that you're doing, and it makes it easier to look at a page of code and see like which operations are working and which are not. I think Vim is just an old school version of that. So I wouldn't be worried that people don't know how to use Vim. I think most people who have moved off of Vim just like the alternatives in the way they display information, and it's not really changing the core of what's being done in that environment.
Okay, so then all of my takes are cold. We're throwing them out the window, but that's okay because I still got to get a point across that doesn't apply here.
It's all good. I mean, I just, when you said that, I knew I've seen Vim and I've seen people talk about writing in Vim, but I knew it wasn't like a language. So assuming we're on board here with Ken as a founder, let's talk about the opportunity ahead of Preteckt. It seems like we've spent a little bit of time here in our episode with Super Dispatch. This is a little bit different. What did you think about the opportunity here?
So I worked in business development, which is essentially internal mergers and acquisitions. I know that sometimes people call sales business development, sometimes they call market research business development. But in the job I was doing, it was essentially internal mergers and acquisitions, business development for a company in Cleveland called Bendix Commercial Vehicle Systems. They make the brakes that stop these big trucks. So Freightliner, Volvo, all of the ones that he mentioned, that's what they do. They make the air brakes. In my research, I did a market analysis of all of the different companies that are out there that make any part that goes into a big truck. There are hundreds, Jay. And a lot of those make over $1 billion in revenue a year. Like, this market is massive and people don't really know about it. Like, these are companies that are in Sheffield, Ohio and Aurora, Ohio, and some random town in Michigan and some random town in Indiana and some random town in Pennsylvania. But they hire a couple hundred engineers and they are just churning out this one specific product that goes into every single commercial vehicle system in the world. And it's crazy because there's so much money in it. I did a quick look just to see if I could figure out, okay, how big is this diagnostics market? And the first number I found for the automotive diagnostics scan tools market for both passenger and commercial is $52.73 billion.
Whoa, that's crazy. He didn't give us any numbers that were that big in the interview. I mean, he talked about fleet sizes. I wonder where that 52 plus $billion expenses come from in terms of the actual customers. Because the customers he mentioned were super fleets, telematics companies, and manufacturers. So I guess he gave us the numbers for fleets. We did not get numbers from the telematics companies, which sounds like a lot about what you're saying there with the 52 billion, or manufacturers, which I would expect to be a lot of money from either of those. So yeah, I mean, I love this interview, and you've broken down our market size buckets before per se.
Yeah, so there's 4 market buckets. There's less than $1 billion of market size. That's what we would consider a pretty small market that you have to dominate. There's 1 to 5 billion, which is a decently sized market, but you still have to kind of dominate it. There's 5 to call it 10 to 15 billion, and that's a good sized market on a yearly basis. That's a healthy market that you don't have to dominate, but you do have to, you can ride the wave of that market. And then there's everything that's bigger than that. And once you get bigger than that, it's very big. And I don't think there's a point for an early stage investor to fight over a number that's 25 billion or 26 billion. The number doesn't really matter at that point. It's the fact that it's a large enough market. I think that this market is a large enough market, and the extra data provided by Preteckt, the extra data it's pulling, is only going to increase that.
This starts to get to where I get a little bit fuzzy in this interview, because we start talking about Ken and his background, and I'm like, this is awesome. This is awesome. Starts talking about the technology and how they implement it and the talent on their team to figure out how to use it in such a practical, useful way for customers. And I'm saying, this is awesome. Then he starts laying out these customers. And then I start questioning things like, how many people are on the team? How are you fulfilling all these different things that are going on at once? We have a partnership with Bridgestone we're talking about. We're working with the Memphis Area Transit Authority. We're working with super fleets and also telematics companies and also manufacturers. We're doing software and we're doing hardware. We have 3 different business models, with the SaaS and the hardware. So I just didn't have enough time to pull everything together and really understand a little more tightly how these things are all working, because I got really excited about astrophysics and some of the earlier parts of the interview. So, my gut tells me this is huge, and Preteckt is doing something that no one else that I could find is really doing, and that's going to be super valuable. And I think it's extremely valuable even in an autonomous age, because as Ken mentioned, I don't think those companies are necessarily thinking about the maintenance that goes on with these trucks or even cars that are autonomously driving across the country. I think he's in a really good defensible position here. I just ultimately couldn't come to a place where I'm like, okay, this opportunity is this big. It just kind of got to a place in my head where I thought, huge, and almost maybe too good to be true. But I think that just comes from me not having enough time to ask more questions.
I feel like there's one core product, and they expanded kind of ancillary services based on, because they have such huge customers. So when a customer says, hey, I need hardware, and you're like, well, we didn't really want to do hardware, but that's a huge revenue number, I think that you expand to hardware. One thing that I really liked about the business model you were talking about, their team, is this idea that they are trying to eliminate both type 1 and type 2 error. So they have the machine learning algorithm, which is doing its thing, and then they have a person who's kind of reviewing the machine learning algorithm. So it's not just one layer, okay, we're going to send this truck to the shop, and it gets to the shop and there's nothing wrong with it. And it's not the other way where, okay, there's an alert, but it doesn't seem that bad, let's not worry about it. And then there's downtime. So I like that there's kind of this 2-layer approach to making sure that when they send something to the shop, it should be being sent to the shop.
Yeah, everything you said just spoke to, we have systems in place to make sure that we are continuously improving on what we do best, which is the data science. And there's a lot of protections around it. It even seemed a little, as you were saying, a little human intensive to make sure that there's not only a technician on behalf of the company or somebody who's fixing the vehicle there, but that Preteckt is aware of and analyzing what's happening so they can improve the systems themselves. And when he mentioned that the number of vehicles per technician being used right now, industry standard is 25 vehicles per technician. Preteckt has gotten that up to 250 vehicles per technician and wants to get to around 1,000 before going into commercial vehicles. That speaks to a huge cost savings in my mind that Preteckt should be able to carve quite a bit of revenue out of.
Did I understand this right, that they only have one technician right now?
I did not have that note, so I'm not sure.
Okay, let's assume that I am right. I think I remember him talking about how incredible this technician was. And maybe it's a master technician and there's a couple under him. But to the extent that there's a concentration of employment around this one person, that's a shadow for me. Because this person has learned your system better than anyone else. He's the one who can train someone. And if he leaves or something happens, then that number, that 200 number that they want to get to 1,000 might get reset back with someone new. So there's definitely a employee consolidation risk there.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think you could be right. He mentioned that his entire team is 10 people. So there's probably one individual that's overseeing all the technicians that are working on the vehicles. He's not the one that's actively working on it. He's just kind of monitoring, to my understanding, what is going on when a vehicle does get a signal to go in for repair and making sure that it's consistent with what they're reporting. But I hear what you're saying, and I think you're right.
But I guess that's not different than any startup where there's employee consolidation. I just think that generally in a startup, the on-ramp time for a new CFO or a new CMO, you take the general skills you knew and you kind of bring them over. This is a proprietary system that is continuously being developed. So not only are the computers learning, but this technician is learning as well over time. So I just think it takes a little bit longer to get back up to speed should anything go wrong.
This is our second company out of Memphis, following on from Somovac. He also spoke highly of Memphis. Memphis being a logistics hub with access to customers within, or so many customers within 20 minutes, he said was huge. All of their founders were in Toronto when they started, and Startco found them and brought them into the Memphis market. One, I'm impressed with how Startco is able to kind of find a company that really fits the niche of Memphis, convince them to move down and have such an impact. Two, this continues to follow on our theme of Memphis being a pretty collaborative place. Granted, Ken and Preteckt were also introduced to us by Katie at Startco, but it's fun to get more and more data points in one ecosystem here to point to what's going on.
Yeah, just broadening that out a bit. I love when we get 3 to 4 data points in a city and we can kind of start to understand that ecosystem from a couple different perspectives. And the theme of collaboration is definitely one that has popped up and stuck in Memphis. Speaking of which, I'm going to be in Memphis in November, so I will have to swing by and report back.
Do you have family there?
I do have family there. I do. I'm going to a wedding in Brownsville, Tennessee. So I'm going to spend Thursday night in Memphis. Get me some barbecue.
All right, Eric. So 6 to 18 months from now, what are you looking for from Preteckt to be even more excited about this opportunity?
I want to see that they've expanded a few more vehicle types. They said that there is a bit of an on-ramp process when they went from commercial to buses. I see this obviously getting into the passenger market eventually, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about maybe mining equipment, or which is a massive market, or construction, or some other type of heavy duty, medium duty type expansion. Because I think that, to me, this is going to be just a long sales process. So I don't know that 6 to 18 months is going to be that indicative for their current customer base. But if they can get some new trials and new spaces, that's going to lead to more and more sales over the next 18 to 36 months once they get some data on new potential verticals. So I want to see some trials in new spaces. Maybe it's more busing, like city trials like they are doing in Memphis, maybe something like that, but out of their kind of core niche to refine those algorithms so that they can attack different verticals that might have shorter sales funnels.
I'm looking to see the traction that they have with the fleets and the types of vehicles that they're in now, how that is growing. But also, Ken mentioned disruption is in the air and everybody is scared. And that's related to autonomous. So I'd love to hear where conversations are with autonomous customers, whether it's the OEMs or telematics companies also working with autonomous customers, and see what the future looks like for Preteckt in an autonomous world to see if they're a market leader.
Do you think that there's going to be big moves in autonomous in the next 6 to 18 months?
I think so. I mean, every projection you hear is people saying, this is going to be on our streets and ruling the streets in the next year. I think
Who talks like that?
a lot of people.
It's going to be ruling the streets.
But I hear some pretty aggressive projections for when autonomous vehicles are out on the roads in a higher mass. But in any case, I think behind the scenes, for them to get ready to go into an environment that will probably be more regulated, these companies are going to be shoring up everything on their back end and behind the scenes. And so I think that Preteckt is in that conversation.
Awesome. Well, Jay, if people want to interact with this episode, where should they go?
If you guys have thoughts on this episode, please tweet at us at UpsideFM or send us an email, hello@upside.fm. And if you like this episode, send it to a friend. Send it to a friend who's in vehicles or repair or diesel mechanics. We'd love to hear their
Or data
input.
science or machine
Or
learning.
data.
Man,
Yeah.
we have a lot of stuff going on in this episode.
Yeah, send it to your mom. We'd love to hear her opinion.
Astrophysics.
Yeah, especially if your mom is an astrophysicist. Let us know what you think, and we'll talk to you next week. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's guest, so shoot us an email at hello@upside.fm or find us on Twitter at UpsideFM. We'll be back here next week at the same time talking to another founder in our quest to find upside outside of Silicon Valley. If you or someone you know would make a good guest for our show, please email us or find us on Twitter and let us know. And if you love our show, please leave us a review on iTunes. That goes a long way in helping us spread the word and continue to help bring high-quality guests to the show. Eric and I decided there were a couple things we wanted to share with you at the end of the podcast, and so here we go. Eric Hornung and Jay Klaus are the founding parties of the Upside podcast. At the time of this recording, we do not own equity or other financial interest in the companies which appear on this show. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinion and do not reflect the opinions of Duff & Phelps LLC and its affiliates, Unreal Collective LLC and its affiliates, or any entity which employ us. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. We have not considered your specific financial situation nor provided any investment advice on this show. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Never mind, bro, that can't be matched. I'm lighting it on fire, used to run victory laps, and still I'm not even tired. It's all about the timing, yeah, that's what they say. Well, I'ma keep